I think we're starting to have some really positive benefits for females across the lifespan. I think we're going to start to look at not only muscle and bone, but the mental health aspect. There's been really good studies out of Utah showing that females that have clinical depression on medication, when they take creatine, those symptoms seem to subside. So I also like the area looking at the overall health benefits. Can we improve or offset metabolic diseases such as obesity?
So creatine used to be a product that mostly bodybuilders would use. Those days are long gone. Feels like creatine is now a must-have daily use health product. Why?
Well, it's an excellent segue. I think it's probably because we're starting to unravel evidence-based research suggesting that it has a gamut of potential benefits for everybody across the lifespan, including pregnancy all the way up to your grandparents. And I think what's happened is, yes, it used to make athletes bigger, stronger, faster. And now it's starting to have implications for bone health, brain health, for pregnancy, an increase in energy status. So it's something we naturally produce in the body. And it's something that seems to have a lot of health benefits over time. And I think it's based on the evolution, if you will, of creatine research.
So there are a couple of things I want to unpack. First were the specific benefits. So muscle, brain, bone, pregnancy, and another one I'm going to throw in there, weight management. So can we deconstruct? Let's walk through those five.
Yeah, so I think the important thing for most of the listeners is to realize creatine is very similar to protein. We do consume it in the diet primarily through red meat or seafood, or we make it naturally in the liver and the brain. And our muscle is very unique. It doesn't make its own creatine, so it does take up what's in the bloodstream, either through supplementation, the diet, or what's being made in the liver. And when creatine will get in skeletal muscle, it allows the muscle to potentially have more energy to do more work. And that's where it's really got its popularity. Linford Christie won the gold medal in 1992 in Barcelona. And when asked what ergogenic aid he was taking, it was creatine, and then it sort of exploded. And then we start to see a lot of athletes get bigger, stronger, faster. So muscle utilizes creatine potentially to do more work. And that's why creatine used to be only thought of for a compound for the weight room. And we'll talk about now it's being involved in all types of sport, including endurance athletes and running. The skeletal muscle seems to be the best tissue to respond to creatine. 95% of your creatine in the body is actually in your skeletal muscle. The remaining 5% is in bone, brain, and other tissues. So since the vast majority is in our muscle, that's where we use it the most. And anecdotally, a lot of people say they can do more repetitions. They've gotten stronger. Their muscles don't seem to be as sore. So that allows them to train more frequently. So I'd be shocked at the upcoming Paris Olympics if the vast majority of the athletes, if not all the athletes, are either increased creatine in their diet or taking it through supplementation.
So in terms of maintaining or building lean muscle mass, whatever stage, whether you're a seasoned athlete like an Olympian or I'm new at this, what I'm hearing is creatine is something you're going to want to supplement with and or make sure you're ingesting enough through food.
Yeah, there's a couple really cool and important key factors there. So for the vegans, vegetarians listening, they're naturally producing a small amount in their liver and brain, and they can live a long, healthy, successful life from a muscle performance perspective with no supplementation or dietary creatine. However, the vast majority of research suggests that if you can increase it a little amount, not a lot is needed, you can actually get an improvement in performance or an improvement in body composition, primarily lean tissue mass or strength. So for those emphasizing a vegan, vegetarian, or plant-based diet, supplementation is likely the only way to get a few more grams in your body a day. But for the omnivores or on a carnivore diet, you're probably getting an adequate amount either through the diet or synthesis in the body. You may not need supplementation. And again, this is primarily only from a muscle perspective. When we get to a bone perspective and brain, we think everybody needs more. And that's probably why it's one of the few compounds that supplementation is very convenient it's very, very safe. Creatine would probably be the safest, most effective compound, even greater than caffeine right now, that a lot of humans can take in. You don't need a lot. It's not like protein where you need hundreds of grams a day. You can get benefits in as little as 2 to 5 grams of creatine per day. So I think that's why it's becoming a more of a global or a health-related compound to sort of get some small improvements.
So let's segue to brain and bone.
Well, it was kind of by accident, but I'm very glad they did find this because I'm not sure what I would have done for my career. But the interesting thing is it sort of segued really from muscle into bone. And, when you look in the mirror, and most people are not concerned with bone health unless you're typically an older female prone to osteoporosis or postmenopausal. But what we thought, or the theory was, when you're having larger muscle, it's causing this muscle bone interaction. So muscle is pulling on your bone all the day when you're performing activities of daily living or working out. And lo and behold, just like your muscle, bone cells, which actually deposit more calcium into your skeleton, use creatine for energy. And when these bone building cells were in the presence of creatine, they got more energized. So the theory here was that maybe creatine could act as fuel for bone building cells, and what populations may benefit to having greater bone health. That would be females primarily across the lifespan. But we see the best results in postmenopausal females, probably because of cessation of estrogen. Estrogen is a very anabolic hormone for the bone. When the ovaries are not producing enough estrogen to maintain adequate physiology, this is where creatine may help rescue some of those effects. And then we started to do some clinical trials, and it did see an improvement in bone mineral density preservation in postmenopausal females. And to your point, I would say the last 10 years and probably into the next 30 years in the future, the neck up is going to be the biggest area of focus. The brain does make its own creatine, so it's very resistant to supplementation, but it can trickle in. And so the theory here is, unlike muscle, bone may take about 8 to 10 grams per day. We think brain may take a little bit longer, and to accumulate in the brain to get those antidepressive effects, maybe or improvements in cognition. That's where it seems to be the evolution of creatine research over time. Now, can you take one dose for muscle, one dose for bone, and one dose for brain? No. I personally take 10 grams a day to sort of hit the whole body. But if you say, I'm just taking creatine for muscle, you can get benefits in 2 to 5 grams a day. Bone is about 8 to 10. And then brain can be about 5 grams for longer or a higher dose. But please note, 99% of all these benefits is driven by exercise. If you just take creatine without exercise, you're likely not going to get any of these substantial beneficial effects.
So a couple of things to unpack there. So it sounds like, most studies are done at this 5-gram threshold, where there's lots of benefits. Where I think it seems like there's some at 3, 2 to 3, the majority are at 5. But from what I'm hearing, if you're older, if you're a woman who's older, where you want more brain and bone, you probably want to go higher. And if you're active and doing resistance training, you're probably gonna want to go higher in that 10-gram. Am I hearing correctly?
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. I think what happens is, as we get older, we're losing muscle, we're losing bone tissue, and there's some evidence that, brain function will be impaired as well. So maybe you need more, just like protein with aging, you may need more to offset the biological processes. So I think a very viable strategy is, if you're just starting out, you may want to start with a little bit, 3 to 5 grams a day, see how you feel, how you like it, and then sort of titrate yourself up. But I don't think anybody needs really more than 10 grams a day. That seems to be a very viable and safe, effective dose that sort of hits most facets of the body.
So on Instagram, you mentioned menopausal women, and you shared this on Instagram. I found this fascinating. A study of menopausal women, they were taking higher dosages. I believe it was 11 grams of creatine daily, along with something else you mentioned, resistance training and walking.
Yes.
All fans of all three. And the benefits were remarkable. Can you share what those benefits were?
Yeah, it was a 2-year study, and we were very fortunate to get over 200 postmenopausal females. And one of the big limitations in human scientific or nutrition research is it's very hard to get people to volunteer. So we had a lot of work, and it took about 10 years to do completely. And what we saw was 2 years of supervised weight training and walking, combined, as you mentioned, 11 grams of creatine a day. And we really chose a really high dose to overcome those impairments, which we just talked about, and some really key findings. It sort of preserved bone density or bone strength around the hip region. It sort of made the bone or maintained the bone rigidity. It improved lean tissue mass and gait speed. And this is in comparison to the females who just consumed a placebo, who had a slight reduction. So what does this really mean? Well, exercise has to be there as a driving force, and creatine can give you some small, greater effects. I think the big question is, what if we had a population or a group that did no exercise? I think those results would be very negative and very alarming. So for the females watching, primarily postmenopausal, or actually any female or anybody watching, please exercise. Weight training is very, very important. Cardiovascular exercise is very, very important. And anytime you can consume creatine either through the diet or supplementation, you'll probably get some small, greater effects.
Something I like to say is you can't supplement your way out of a bad diet or no exercise. You just can't do it. You got to, if you're dialing in nutrition and exercise, you will experience more benefits when you supplement for sure.
Exactly.
So I want to get clarity on what they were doing. So what was the frequency and duration on the walking and resistance training for these women?
So resistance training was 3 times a week. It was a whole body machine based program. Ideally, we wanted them to come in every other day to give them a bit of rest. So maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday. But walking was done on their own in a supervised manner with an exercise log. And we tried to get them to do the 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous walking per week. A lot of those would divide it up into every day, about 20 some minutes a day, or other individuals would go up a little bit more. So we tried to adhere to the Canadian guidelines. I believe they're the exact same in the United States. Most would argue it's too low, but we tried to get them to the 150 minutes of cardiovascular exercise in combination with a little bit more frequency of weight training, which we still think needs a lot more push from governmental agencies to show the benefits of exercise. But 3 days a week for 2 years, and then again, 6 days a week of walking, or if they achieve the 150 minutes of walking.
That's really not that bad.
Not that bad. It was very viable, no side effects. And most people, it was very achievable in their day. Yeah.
We haven't aired these, or maybe they will have aired while this runs, but we've done an episode on VO2 max, and I'm listening to some of those routines. I'm like, oh man, oof.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest things is when you're dealing with human research is you need to do it or create it that it's sustainable and they would do this in their real life. I think some of the issues with some of these advanced cardiovascular programs, if someone's not really going to do it, it's good to create mechanistic information for the lab. But we're trying to really promote health to the population. At the ISSN conference, some of the stats were like 75% of America is obese. I mean, this is going to be catastrophic from a healthcare a crisis. So we're trying to improve way of life, and some of the ways to do that is with exercise by far.
So you mentioned obesity, and I think one of the most important conversations right now is around body recomp.
Yes.
I think this is an important shift where a decade or so ago, the conversation was around restriction, cleansing, juicing. I'm got to eat less, got to do more cardio. And that clearly didn't work. I think it's a much better conversation to say, no, you need to eat more protein. You need to get in the gym. You need to maybe take creatine, and you don't need to lose weight. We're just going to change how that weight, we're going to do a body recomp. I think that's a lot more attainable for people. And I think we're going to get people healthier. And I want to segue to, lean muscle mass, losing fat, body recomp. Another study you've referenced in your work, there's a group that just does resistance training, and you compare it to a group that does resistance training with creatine. Let's talk about what happened there.
Yeah, there's lots of studies, reputable and reliable, clearly showing that the combination of creatine and resistance training, it will increase lean tissue mass, regional muscle size, and strength. So that's been shown numerous times. that the combination of creatine and resistance training will increase lean tissue or measures of muscle mass and strength compared to weight training alone. Now, the question is, how much is the increase? Well, from a whole body lean tissue mass, it's about 3 kilograms, or sorry, 1.5 kilograms or about 3 pounds. And that is really, really important as we get older. Keep in mind, around the fourth decade is when we start to lose precious muscle mass. So if creatine can help either maintain that or even increase that, that's a huge win, especially for older adults. And then look at the younger individuals. We're trying to build up the body as big as we can. So when the biological process of aging does occur, we have more to start with. I think the big underlying factor there is strength. The lack of strength is the number one reason people are placed in long-term care facilities, because they can't live freely independently. And creatine and exercise seems to augment muscle strength that way as well. But from a recomposition perspective, we've also put out a few meta-analyses recently that creatine decreases fat mass. So this is very interesting, that if you get an increase in muscle mass, and creatine will give you a very, very, very small decrease in fat mass, from a body composition perspective, is very, very viable. Exercise was the driving force, but I think a lot of individuals, primarily young females, are very hesitant to take creatine because you can get some water retention or bloating. And I think there's a bit of error in the dosing why that happens. But overall, it seems that creatine has a favorable effect on body composition. If you do notice the number on the scale go up in the first week, it's probably just water retention. And I can talk about some strategies that are likely to alleviate that, especially for people who are hesitant to take creatine.
Let's talk about that, because I do think a concern for people is bloating or water retention. What can people do?
This typically only happens during what they call the creatine loading phase. So this is very popular. It's the most effective way to sort of rapidly saturate your muscles. This loading phase is where you take 20 grams a day for about 5 to 7 days. And the reason it causes water retention, creatine is an osmotic compound. It likes to take water with it as it moves throughout the body. So when creatine is in your blood and it starts to go into your muscle, it takes water with it. So you start to get an increase in intracellular water in the muscle, which is great. Turns on a lot of beneficial things that could cause an increase in muscle growth. But you also retain some water as well. And so therefore, when you go on the scale, and just say if you were starting at 50 kilograms, you did the loading phase and you went up to 53. A lot of people do not like that. And I don't think you need to do the loading phase unless you're an athlete. I think you could start as little as 3 grams a day. And you could even divide that dose up into 2 1.5 gram dosages. Take it in the morning and afternoon. That's going to substantially reduce any net water drag or retention. And I think that's an easy way to get people into it. And then maybe work your way up to 5, 8, and then 10 grams. See what's the best strategy for you.
So you're hitting on frequency and dosage. And so it sounds like if you haven't been active, you're starting at maybe 0, you're sedentary, you don't do resistance training, you don't really walk, start very low dosage, work yourself up. Assume you've got a population of people listening who are active. They do the resistance training, they run, they walk, they're ingesting protein. If it sounds like 5 is kind of the dosage and you want to go maybe higher for people who want to get more benefits and who are fairly active. You mentioned the 20 grams, that's a lot. That's a lot. Like, how do you think about splitting the dose, like the going from 5 to 10, possibly 20, cycling, or maybe one day I'm doing 5 and then one day and then I'm doing 20, then maybe I'm taking off. There are all these crazy strategies you read about online. Frequency, dosage.
Let's start with frequency. I think if the individual is exercising, I think one of the biggest things is consistency. It's unlike caffeine. Creatine needs to accumulate in those tissues. So whatever is the most easiest way for you to ingest it. So for example, my 10 grams a day, I take 5 with breakfast and I drink 5 in a water bottle during my workout. That's very easy. So the frequency seems to be a factor that the smaller the dosages, you may retain more creatine than taking it at a massive bolus dose. We don't know if there's a huge difference, but I think the frequency could be there, that you can divide this up as much as you like. Do not go any lower than 1 gram per serving. 1 gram has not been shown to elevate creatine in the blood, but 5 grams seems to be a very viable dose that really peaks the bloodstream, and then that'll allow that to get into the demanding tissues. So let's go back to dose, because that'll really dictate the frequency. If you say, I just want to start with 3 grams a day, you can take that easily in one time, like an easy bolus dose. You throw it in your yogurt or whatever you're eating, or you can drink it in water. If you're taking 5 grams, you can also take that all at once or divide that up into 2.5 gram dosages. I think if you get over 5 is where you may want to split it up into smaller dosages. So for example, if you do take 10, you could take 3, 3, and 4, or you could take 2 5s. It's really whatever's convenient for you. But I will say that if you take a single dose in the morning, it takes about 5 hours to 7 hours before those numbers come back to baseline. So you can easily spread that out as much as you like. The times that you're metabolically stressed, people like to increase creatine. For example, when I fly over to Europe, I'm very susceptible to jet lag. I will take 20 grams because creatine has a lot of cognitive benefits for sleep deprivation. And then I'll take a lot more because now I need stuff getting into the brain. So I'm going to need to take a little bit more over time. So the frequency and dose are really important. I think if you're just taking a small amount, you can take that in multiple small dosages or a single dose, whatever's convenient for you.
So if I'm going to take the 2 5s a day and I'm working out, do I take pre-workout, post-workout? And there's the whole, I've got to take creatine during workout or maybe just after workout or before workout. How do you think about that anabolic window? If I'm sold on taking, call it 5 grams or 2 5 grams, that I got to work out.
Yeah. So the anabolic window in creatine doesn't exist. So you can take creatine at any time of the day.
That's amazing.
It is. So we thought there was, based on a seminal study in 1992, which showed that muscle contractions will increase creatine uptake. So although the timing is irrelevant per se, the evidence clearly suggests that a very important time to take it, it's not critical, but it is an important factor, is around the time you work out. And there's a couple of logical theories with this. Blood flow is elevated, but these doorways that allow creatine into your muscle are elevated. So I always like to personally take creatine after or during my workout when all my muscles are activated. It kind of acts as a vacuum and will take in creatine that way. But there's other studies that show people get benefits from the morning and late evening. So unlike caffeine, the timing seems to be irrelevant from a big critical factor.
So you mentioned caffeine. This is the thing, mixing creatine with coffee.
We're just on the cusp of releasing part 2 of this big myths and misconceptions paper on creatine. So I answer this sort of from a mechanistic standpoint. If you just say, is there evidence to suggest that creatine and caffeine can oppose each other? There's 100% good evidence out of Europe saying yes. So those two molecules at the cellular level seem to interfere with each other. However, most individuals consume their caffeine in tea or coffee or a caffeinated beverage. The dose that seems to be needed to interfere is at least about 200, if not 300 milligrams in their coffee. So that would be a large Starbucks or, a big.
That's massive. That's like 32 ounce coffee. Massive.
It would be a massive. So a small black coffee is only 80 milligrams. Most K-cups are 80 milligrams. A small can of Red Bull is 80 milligrams. Even bigger energy drinks are higher. So I think the evidence is there that the two molecules can oppose each other. There is evidence that when you combine the two, they do interfere with each other. Then you have other studies that suggest no. But if you're just throwing your creatine in your cup of coffee in the morning, I think that's a very easy and viable way to get it into you. I would highly doubt that they interfere with each other at a low dose caffeine. So I think it's based on the dose of caffeine. If it's above 300 milligrams chronically, they could interfere with each other. So if you just say I'm taking 5 grams of creatine in my morning coffee and I have 1 or 2 cups, that's only 160 milligrams of caffeine. That's probably not going to interfere with each other.
So in terms of combining, is there anything beneficial in terms of vitamins, minerals, electrolytes comes to mind, magnesium, taurine, all come to mind? I'm curious your take on those 3 or any others that may be beneficial.
Yeah, there's no big research looking at creatine in combination with taurine, magnesium, or other types of vitamins or micronutrients. The biggest bang for your dollar is when creatine is combined with protein. So this right now seems to be the whey-based proteins, but they need to look at the plant-based proteins to see if you still get the synergistic effect with the lower composition of leucine primarily. So the best evidence looks at creatine in combination with protein, and that's primarily dairy-based. There has been some studies looking at protein and omega-3s, and that's been shown to be beneficial as well. Mark Tarnopolsky and McMaster's looked at conjugated linoleic acid and coenzyme Q10, and not shown any bigger effects there as well. But I think the best strategy is combining with protein. The pioneering work showed creatine and carbohydrates were very beneficial to sort of super augment that into the muscle. The problem with the carbohydrate is it does spike and release insulin just like protein, but the dose of carbohydrates you need is probably very, very high. And most people don't want simple sugars in their diet anymore. So I think it goes back to two things. Exercise is a great way to get creatine into the muscle. Protein is also a really good way as well. And all those things you mentioned, taurine, magnesium, they're usually found in food or the food matrix. So maybe creatine can be taken in that way. But I'm sure there's going to be individual studies looking at creatine in combination with individual compounds coming up.
Jason Walkup here, founder and co-CEO of mindbodygreen and the host of the mindbodygreen podcast. Please subscribe. You'll never miss a show and you won't regret it. But the big one, high quality whey, amino acid profile, specifically leucine, north of that 2.5 grams to trigger muscle protein synthesis. And that's kind of the magic of protein, leucine, creatine.
Yeah. And I would be very surprised if the plant-based proteins don't do the same effect. I mean, just because they have a lower concentration of the essential amino acids, they're still a protein and they will release insulin because they're gluconeogenic. So that's an interesting, I think the next line of thinking is creatine and maybe an animal-based protein versus creatine and a plant-based protein to see if there's any difference there. The other big one that's getting a lot of press is collagen. Could creatine plus collagen have some potential bone effects? We've thought about that as well as a super type of study moving forward. So there's lots of possibilities. I'm super excited to be part of it. And yeah.
I'm game for that one. I specifically take my whey, collagen, and creatine all at once.
I literally did that this morning, and I put it in Greek yogurt because I kind of like to eat it, and I find it so I try to get about 50 grams of protein at breakfast because we don't think the protein at lunch is really, really critical. It's the later meal, and I find it's a great way to start out the day, and I like to work out in the afternoon, so I know I have a good base of protein now.
So I want to zoom back out and come back to where we started, and it's this seismic shift in perception where creatine was bodybuilders. And now it's a daily health product. If we're talking about muscle, brain, bone, pregnancy, which I want to come back to, I think that's interesting. Could you spend a little bit of time on the benefits by gender, specifically women? Because there's been a huge shift in terms of perception around women and creatine and benefits.
Yeah, it's the main focal point of my research is to look at the benefits for females across the lifespan. And you're right, there was a big stigma or myth, creatine just used to be like for males trying to get really big, stronger, faster. There's been some really exceptional research led by Abby Smith-Ryan out of North Carolina showing that females improve strength, exercise performance, and have improvements in body composition, which is hugely important for females because they're so underrepresented in sport nutrition research. And then we'll talk about pregnancy soon. But, if you get anybody, a biological male or female, to improve not only muscle mass and strength, but what about now improving bone health? That can have really huge implications for offsetting osteopenia and osteoporosis. We're not seeing a big sex effect from the brain up for depression or things like that, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But from pregnancy, Stacey Ellery out of Australia is the world leader, and primarily based on animal models, they're showing some potential beneficial effects of decreasing inflammation or increasing energy for the mother and proper fetal development. But we need long-term clinical trials before we can sort of, make or recommend creatine as a blanket statement for females. So for any females watching, pregnant, or thinking of becoming pregnant, please talk to their medical practitioner. But the current body of evidence, and that's going to be in part 2 of this big paper we're coming up, again, based primarily on animal models, the creatine seems to maintain energy or decrease inflammation, which has some favorable effects for not only fetal development, proper pregnancy development, but also maintaining energy for the mother.
And so, in terms of women and consumption, how early should someone start considering taking creatine?
Yeah, I guess this goes back to, since we're naturally producing it, I don't know if there's an age too young. There's good researchers also showing that creatine has been favorable for children and adolescents. So I think since we're naturally consuming it in the diet, naturally producing it, most of the good evidence doesn't have an age minimal or maximal range. It's kind of like protein. Most infants are taking milk. It's a protein or things like that. You're not going to probably supplement your child with creatine, but the application is there until we have a little bit more clinical trial guidance. I don't know if there is a minimal age, just because we're naturally synthesizing it.
It feels to me instinctively, and I have no medical training whatsoever, obviously, when someone starts to become more active in terms of resistance training, endurance, like a little bit more serious athletically, that's when it probably makes sense because then I'm going to be concerned, a lot more concerned about protein consumption, recovery. And I think like lean muscle mass, recovery, I think protein, I think creatine.
That is 100% a perfect segue. When you or the tissue is stressed, this is where creatine probably will help the best. So, for example, if you're not exercising, you're not going to get any benefits from creatine. But if you started to exercise and then all of a sudden you're getting older and then you're sleep deprived, this is where creatine sort of comes to the rescue. Because at the end of the day, it helps maintain the energy currency of our cell. And when our cells are stressed, that's when it's going through it.
I know we touched on this. What I'm interested in terms of research, if it goes there specifically, creatine and taurine and creatine and electrolytes, because taurine essentially energy, like I'm working out energy, and then electrolytes, like essentially recovery, like making sure I stay hydrated. I think those two are interesting to me as someone who's active. Those are things I'm thinking about pre, during, and post workout and affect my performance and affects my ability to recover.
That's right. It seems to be you're sort of priming the body before you do the work. During, you're helping to maintain it, and then post your recovery. So I look at creatine as it's a very viable option to sort of refuel and recharge the body for the next subsequent day. And if you're a football player getting ready for the NFL and you're training in the heat morning and evening, the body goes through a lot of stress. And this is where some of these compounds, you already mentioned protein, there's lots of others like beta alanine, but creatine seems to be at the top of the mountain because it kind of does a whole gamut of a variety of effects. They're not large effects, but please note they are there.
So something else too, as relates to, benefits as we age, I just think it's so important. So I want to double click. Bone health for women is a concern. And I think if we go back 20 years ago or 10 years ago, or maybe current state in some places, women are told, drink more milk, calcium. And it feels like, and it's a real concern. Bone health as you age is real. That's a concern. My mother's in good shape. She's in her early 70s. She's very active, and like her bone density is not good. This is like a concern for someone. She's drinking milk. I'm like, okay, mom, we'll do that. I'm glad you're doing it. But like, this is a very real benefit.
Yes, it's almost a surprise benefit. And again, when we're showing that in combination with exercise, preserving, like most people, as we get over the age of 50, if you said, are you willing to preserve what you have? I think most people say yes. And can I get any benefits? Yes, I can. Again, they're not huge. But imagine telling your mother or your grandmother that we're going to help maintain the integrity of your hip bone or your lower limb bone. That has huge implications as well.
So, we started off by saying it's gone from bodybuilders to an everyday daily health product. And it feels like this has happened very quickly, almost overnight, when in the reality, creatine is probably the most widely studied supplement around. If I'm like, I'm talking, you tell me, like, why does it feel like this just happened overnight when in reality, like, how many studies are there? Thousands.
Yeah, I just talked about this in Florida. So it was discovered in 1832. And the ironic thing is it got a lot of press in 1992 when the first studies came out, and I already mentioned Linford Christie winning the gold medal. And then it was like, wow, every study was showing athletes would get bigger, stronger, faster. Then it went away. We thought we knew everything there was about creatine. We were only concerned about it for muscle. And then in the early 2000s, a couple other cellular studies came out looking at the effects on bone cells because they said, well, geez, maybe these cells use creatine just like our muscle. And now it's exploded. And it is the most researched, effective, and safest ergogenic aid that people can consume. There's over 1,000 peer-refereed publications on creatine supplementation, which is mind-boggling when you think of it. And we've now gone from pregnancy to children to adolescence. Now we're looking at the perimenopausal into the postmenopausal years. The brain has taken on a new life of its own, from concussion to depression, sleep deprivation, cognition. So it seems to sort of hit all those areas that we're starting to see.
Sleep. Tell me more.
Sleep deprivation is very interesting. So most of us go through periods of, I'm not sleeping well, jet lag, working overnight, university students cramming. So one of the common denominators is that when the brain is metabolically stressed, it uses a lot more energy, and creatine sort of sacrifices itself to maintain energy. So what they're starting to see is that when the brain is stressed, it will actually take up more creatine from the bloodstream or rely more on supplementation. And therefore, creatine has now been shown to maintain cognition or memory during times of sleep deprivation. This has been in young and older adults. It's also been shown to improve memory in older adults. So the theory here is that when the brain is stressed, creatine sort of acts as sort of like an anti-inflammatory. It decreases the metabolic stress and allows the brain to recover. And this is probably why you hear anecdotally, it's never been shown compared to placebo, but this is interesting, that when people take creatine, they say, I don't require as much sleep. And when you look at the mechanisms, it may make sense that the reason we're sleeping is to sort of regenerate a lot of factors and recover the brain cells. But maybe creatine speeds up the rate of recovery just like it does from muscle. And that's been shown in the rodent model, primarily in rats. But there is some logic there that maybe you don't need as much sleep, or you can function better on creatine. The dose needed is high. So unlike muscle and bone, the best lines of evidence show that you need that loading phase, about 20 grams a day for at least 7 days. There's been a few studies showing that about 4 to 5 grams a day for several months have been beneficial, and that's primarily the symptoms of long COVID. But again, the brain has the blood-brain barrier, and it also makes creatine. So that's why we think more is needed. And that's why I take 10. If you just did muscle, bone, and brain, I do the math. On average, you take those three tissues, it's about 30 grams needed, divide by 3. So about 10 grams seems to be viable.
So I want to talk more about the loading phase. And so I'm a big fan of doing N-of-1 experiments. I did one where I started I'm fairly active. I do resistance training. I'm an ex-athlete, although I'm almost 50. I started with creatine about a year ago. Did resistance training 3 times a week, about 45 minutes, pretty hard. Was able to gain about 5 pounds of lean muscle mass in a month. I went off of it. Not pretty. Lost half of the muscle mass. Recovery was poor. Felt weak. Like it wasn't a good N-of-1 experiment. I went back. Muscle mass has come back. Recovery, everything we've talked about, I felt it. And now I'm thinking, okay, I feel like I'm a well-trained athlete for my age. And now I'm listening to you. And I'm like, if I'm a well-trained athlete and I'm doing my 5 grams a day, how should I think about loading if I'm well-trained? Like maybe I'm not ready to go 10 a day, but maybe on days I go hard, I'm going to do 10. Or maybe I'm going to pick a week and go 20. This is for like someone who's well trained. Let's spend a little bit of time about like loading. If five is my baseline, I'm all in on the benefits. I feel great. How should I think about the 10, the 15s, the 20s?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We don't have any evidence on fluctuations of daily intake. But I will say this, that once your muscles are saturated, and it doesn't take a lot, it takes about 4 weeks for those levels to come back down once you stop. So when you just said you stopped taking creatine and you felt like you've lost, your creatine stores were still elevated above baseline. However, To get those levels back, it doesn't take a lot. So you can, as a well-trained individual, do the loading phase if you like, but that might be a little bit of overkill because you still had higher amounts in the muscle. I would probably agree with you that maybe go back to the 5 or even take maybe 7 or 8 grams a day starting. You're going to retain more and you're going to have less urinary creatine going down the toilet. So, after your 4 weeks off or whatever it is and you go back, I think start with 5 or 8 grams a day. And that's going to maximize your levels very, very quickly. But we don't know if you should fluctuate daily. It's probably no reason that suggests you can't. I do that if I say, if someone invites me to Europe, I'm like, oh God, I got a jet lag, I'll increase it quite a bit. But I really try to maintain consistency for the whole idea that I know my muscles are fully saturated. Now I'm hoping some are trickling into my bone and brain, and that's the overall goal.
So it sounds like 5 or 10, and pick a number, but 5's your bare minimum. Maybe you do 10 if you really want to maximize benefits and just be consistent. This isn't a let's experiment and go to 20 and go off. Like 5 or 10 daily, non-negotiable.
The lowest daily dose is 3, actually. So if you didn't do a loading phase and you say, I'm just starting from day 1, the lowest dose that's shown to be effective is 3 grams. That will saturate your muscles in about a month. But most people like to give a little bit more because it's very viable and then you get the performance benefits with it. Yeah.
Well, I want the brain. If I'm doing this, if I'm taking something, I want all the benefits.
Yeah, so 3 and 5 are probably, if they do get in the brain, it's going to take a long, long time. And that's why I would recommend if you're trying to hit all facets right off the bat, you're going to need more, definitely more than 5 grams.
So that's interesting. So to be clear, if I'm listening, I'm like, you know what, I'm taking this, I'm sold. I want brain though. So it sounds like 10 is if you want the brain benefit, 10's you're going to be your baseline.
Yeah, 10 to me seems to be the most logical to hit all 3. That'll definitely saturate your muscle. That's been the dose shown to be effective for bone and a dose that seems to be viable to get in the brain. An MRI study way back when clearly showed that 10 grams doubled the amount of brain creatine compared to 4 grams. So that's why we're recommending 10 now. The other question is, what about 15? We don't know, but based on opinion, we're starting to look at 10, but we do need to do some dosing studies, which we're planning.
So you mentioned flying and jet lag. I've got to get on a long flight next week. A lot of people are traveling this summer. How do you think about dosage and jet lag, depending on, you mentioned Europe? Is it, I'll use, for example, an hour for every hour time zone difference, it's like a day of recovery, I think, is a rule of thumb. Is there a rule of thumb for dosage if I'm going from the East Coast to the West Coast or vice versa or to Europe? How do you think about time zones and dosage and jet lag?
Yeah, there's no rule of thumb. It's just to get it into the system earlier on. So I try to do, about 20 grams for about 7 days before I go. But the other key factor is that's getting there. Then the symptoms happen when, you're going to Germany or wherever it is. Try to still take your creatine daily. But here's something that becomes an issue. Most people don't want to take their bag of powder. I mean, there's gummies out there now, but whatever is the most viable. There's 2 things you can do on vacation. If you're not taking your supplement, please exercise. Exercise will help maintain creatine in those cells. And then if you do eat red meat or seafood, make sure that's the focal point when you're eating meals. So for example, if you can eat red meat or seafood, there's about 1 to 2 grams per serving. That's going to help maintain it in the body. But please don't get really worried. If your muscles are saturated, it takes 30 days. In the brain, we think it takes about 5 weeks to come back to baseline. But most people will take their powder with them if they want, and if they're exercising, great. But if you want to go to Mexico and just lay on the beach for a month, that's fantastic. Please note that if you can just maintain some activities of daily living or increase seafood, that's 2 viable ways to maintain those levels in the body.
So in terms of seafood or red meat, are there specific, cuts of meat or types of seafood that are very high?
Yeah, red meat is going to have one of the highest concentrations, so beef will come to mind. The fattier the fish, so mackerel, herring, and salmon seem to have the highest concentrations. Poultry will give you a small amount, but very, very minimal. So red meat and seafood seems to be the greater option. But I know a lot of companies are coming out with like creatine in a candy or a gummy, whichever it is. And that seems to be a great way to travel. The only issue there is we don't have any studies to show that those those delivery agents get in the blood and into the tissue compared to the powder. And the whole time we've been talking about creatine, it's been monohydrate. There's a lot of other marketed forms out there, but monohydrate is the one that's been safe and effective.
Yes, agreed. And so something else as I think about the history of creatine, God, I think a decade, 2 decades ago, there was concern around kidney health and seems to be completely debunked. And when people look at kidney health, they look at creatinine, which is creatine, and that will show up in the blood work. So let's spend a moment around the myths there.
Yeah, there's a lot of myths, but that one comes to light. So creatine is taken into the body, and when it gets into your muscle and broken down, it's formed a byproduct called creatinine. And most people say, oh, I just had that checked off on my blood requisition form when I go for my annual physical. And creatinine is an indicator of kidney function. But the problem is that when you're taking creatine supplementation or you increase it through the diet, when creatine gets metabolized, it shows that your creatinine levels are elevated. And then your doctor says, oh no, your kidney is not filtering that properly. So usually what I recommend to people, and again, I'm not a medical doctor, but please tell your doctor that you're on creatine, because that typically results in high elevated creatinine, which usually is a false positive for kidney failure. And so what happens is the doctors say, go off the supplement, and usually those markers come back to baseline. So you knew it was just a metabolism of the supplement.
And a big one, we've had Dr. Richard Johnson on, who is probably one of the foremost experts on kidney health. And this one is my mother lost one of her kidneys. This is something I'm very concerned about, for her health, my health. And what Richard said, or PSA for anyone concerned about kidney health, one is, if you're really concerned, cystatin C, that's the lab you want. And he also said, even if you're not taking creatine, most people who are just lean and have muscle mass are going to show up high on creatinine. And it is like people like shouldn't even look at it. Like if we're talking about kidneys in the same way the conversation around cardiovascular disease is shifted to ApoB and LPA, like those two first. Kidney health, cystatin C, end of story. Start there. That's like the big one.
And the EGFR is the one they all use, and I get questions almost daily. My elevated creatinine, and again, increased protein, the red meat or seafood creatinine will go up because those animals also have creatine in their muscle tissue as well. So I agree. It's the evolution or advancement in knowledge, but it can cause a lot of anxiety in people, unfortunately.
So what are some of the other misconceptions you've seen?
The two big ones that are prevalent the most is that creatine will increase body weight or fat mass. And I think that's only acutely if you do the loading phase. The other ones for the viewers who can see me is baldness. And this primarily goes to the one study that was done in rugby players many, many years ago, where an elevated amount of creatine increased DHT, which is a surrogate of testosterone and highly linked to hair follicle loss. But please note, there's never been a single study to ever show that creatine was directly linked to hair thinning or hair follicle loss. And I've assessed over 1,000 people easily, and half of those were on creatine and half on placebo. And not a single person has ever come to me and say, hey, whatever you're giving me is causing my hair to thin out. So those are the most popular mainstream. But now we get into some more medical ones, and again, alluding to this big paper we have coming out. Does creatine cause cancer? Does creatine, have adverse effects on blood pressure? All of these are typical myths and not supported by the evidence, and we're really excited to get this more medical-based paper coming out.
So let's talk about this paper, your work in general. What's some of the latest research say? What are you most excited about?
I think we're starting to have some really positive benefits for females across the lifespan. I think we're going to start to look at not only muscle and bone, but the mental health aspect, primarily for females and, of course, males across the lifespan. That's an area that we're looking at. There's been really good studies out of Utah showing that females that have clinical depression on medication, when they take creatine, those symptoms seem to subside. So I think that's going to be a big focal point. I also like the area looking at the overall health benefits. Can we improve or offset metabolic diseases such as obesity, type 2 diabetes? There's a group in Brazil that have shown to have some type 2 diabetic implications there. So I think the medical and rehabilitation aspects of creatine is coming. Right now, our lab is focused on healthy aging, and we're primarily trying to look at improving muscle mass, bone, and functionality in older adults. And if that's the case, then they can live longer free of disease and improve activities of daily living. So I think exercise is the driving force, and creatine can hopefully augment some of those benefits a little bit more.
We've got a ripe audience. Do you need anyone for your study?
We do. Yeah, every time we recruit, I know individuals, if they're, the recruitment is 50 or above, it's a very important aspect, and there's a lot of interest behind it for sure, which is very, very good.
And if you could wave your magic wand, get anyone you wanted, all the funding, what's the study you would do?
I think what we would probably do is look at creatine and exercise from an aspect of female health across the lifespan, primarily getting into muscle, bone, and into the cognition and brain benefits. I think that's an area that is underrepresented and hugely important.
Agreed. So we covered a lot of ground today. Is there anything we didn't cover that you'd like to touch on?
No, I think when we talk, again, it's important for the viewers, creatine is creatine monohydrate. Anyone will do as long as it's third-party tested. The dose is important. The timing seems to be irrelevant. Again, the other question is there anybody that shouldn't take creatine? And the only ones is if you have a pre-existing disease, please get medical screening or importance with that as well. And the other big thing is it does have benefits, but they're not magical. You still need to put the work in. And again, if you have a good diet, adequate sleep, it's one of those things. So the way I preface this is resistance training or exercise is the cake. Protein is the nice icing, and creatine maybe is the sprinkles that'll help individuals eat it a little bit faster. So
well said. I love it. Darren, thank you so much. Where can people find you online and learn more about what you're doing?
yeah, I think Instagram at Dr. Darren Candow is probably the easiest. I try to post a lot of cutting edge research coming out and new ideas. So Instagram seems to be very, very viable at Dr. Darren Candow.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.